My name is Marilyn Brown, and I'm a professor of energy policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology and co-author of a recently published book by MIT Press called Climate Change and Global Energy Security, Technology and Policy Options. We held a debate at Georgia Tech to unfold and discuss the opinions that are put forward by the two authors, myself and Benjamin Sovacool, in this book. And the book debate focused on three topics. First, we have the premise that the problems of climate change and global energy security are two of the biggest challenges facing the 21st century, and that solutions to those challenges must draw from both technology and behavioral sciences. They are socio-technological challenges. And second, we looked for solutions across the globe. So we had international case studies, for instance, dealing with programs in China to bring better cook stoves to large numbers of populations. We had the Bangladesh microfinance program, the Danish wind policy was reviewed, and also we took a look at what Brazil was doing with sugarcane ethanol. In each of those international case studies, we focused on the third theme of the book, which is that a polycentric approach to addressing these problems was most effective. That is, dealing with policy interventions at multiple scales, that is national, district, and local, and engaging many of the stakeholders from the public and also the private sector in order to bring together the kind of massive initiatives needed to address major problems. So I'd like now to turn this over to Benjamin Deitchman, who will introduce all of the participants in the debate.
So we're going to get started with our book debate tonight. So I'm Ben Deitchman. I guess I'm here in my role as president of the Public Policy Graduate Students Association. We're here to discuss the book by Professor Brown and Professor Sovacool. It's called Climate Change and Global Energy Security. It's available outside for purchase. Makes a great stocking stuffer, and some of you will have to read it for class, so you might as well buy 3 or 4 copies. But before you go out and buy it, we're actually going to debate the book's merits. And so we'll start off with Marilyn Brown, who is director of the Climate and Energy Policy Laboratory here at the Georgia Tech School of Public Policy, to defend the resolution that the authors got it right in this book that you should all buy afterwards. And then the first question will go to Judy Curdy, who is chair of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences here at Georgia Tech. Is have the authors characterize the climate challenge correctly? The second question for Bob McGrath. He is the director of the Georgia Tech Research Institute. He is going to let us know, are the authors right that most of the needed technologies already exist? Third, we have Tom Orlando, who is the Associate Dean for Energy Research, and he will answer the question, can we geo-engineer the climate and adapt to its consequences? And the fourth question to Professor Bryan Norton from the School of Public Policy is polycentrism the policy answer? And finally, Benjamin Sovacool, who is our one out-of-town guest. He's a visiting associate professor at Vermont Law School. He will rebut what's been said earlier. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. When there are 2 minutes left, I'll hold up the 2 minutes to go sign, and at 10 minutes we'll shut off the mic. I don't know if we quite have that technology, but yeah. And I guess with that, so you all are encouraged to cheer or boo or show your pleasure or displeasure at what they're saying, since you're part of this. And at the end, you get to vote on whether or not the resolution you have in front of you, if you side with the authors or their opposition. So I will turn it over to Dr. Brown to defend her resolution and her book.
You have to hit the gavel and make it official.
Yes.
afternoon, and thanks for coming. Potentially devastating climate disruption and insecure energy sources will prove to be two of the most critical challenges facing the 21st century. How can we fuel modern society, industrialized economies, and pull developing countries out of poverty without heating the climate, without heating the earth? This book submits that our world already has many of the technology and policy solutions available to meet that challenge, but it faces a system of barriers and reinforcing obstacles that support incumbent technologies and the status quo that handicap innovation and that prevent change. For example, one of my favorite types of technologies are energy efficient technologies. We have a large reservoir of energy efficiency available at our disposal. By energy efficiency, I do not mean warm showers, warm beer and cold showers, excuse me. I mean getting more from the energy that we consume, more services out of the energy that we use, with light bulbs that are more efficient, with electric vehicles rather than gas guzzlers, with high-efficiency factories that also become power producers by using waste heat to generate electricity. But so many barriers prevent these energy efficiency and other alternative energy options from materializing. For example, most public utility commissions reward the sale of power generation. And so if the utilities were to promote efficiency, they would actually suffer in terms of profits. And the ratepayers might be very dissatisfied, certainly the shareholders would be very dissatisfied. Also, the federal government, which collects taxes on gasoline, returns a share of those taxes to states proportionate to the mileage of the cars driven in those states. So we have just a couple of examples of incentives that promote consumption and not efficiency. So our book identifies a whole range of these barriers that lead to maintaining the status quo in the face of superior alternatives. So imagine, let's go through sort of a thought experiment, if policy makers were provided the opportunity to redesign society from the start, including its energy system. Would these policymakers have wished for the following? Would they have wished for global mobility that is dependent upon one exclusive form of refined product as its energy source, that is crude oil with known reserves, concentrated in a handful of countries that are volatile, notably in the Middle East, Russia, Syria, Venezuela? Would we have wanted a society in which 2 billion people live on less than $2 a day, 1.6 billion without access to electricity, 1 million or so don't have access to motorized vehicles, 1.8 million deaths from unsafe drinking water, and the list goes on. At the same time, we have millions of people driving to and from home in sports utility, gigantic sports utility vehicles, coming home at the end of the day to spacious houses that have more televisions than people, each of which consumes 30 watts per day, just as they have the advantage of an instantaneous on. System of valuable materials being placed in landfills and in waste sites all over the planet where they cannot be retrieved, and a production system that puts billions of tons of toxic materials into the air, water, and soil that require the vigilance of future generations to ensure the protection of human health. Well, clearly where we are today is not the responsibility of any single individual or group. It's the accumulation of incremental decisions, and but that sort of thought experiment does force us to conclude that we are not currently using the best-in-class technology or policy options, and our book offers a whole range of these solutions. They're unique in that they're defined at the intersection of technology, policy, and social behavior. They emphasize that in order to promote improved technologies and alter human behavior, we've got to work together to produce meaningful change. Over the past several decades, regulators and policymakers have focused much of their energy and environmental agenda on the titans of industry. Oil barons are a particular favorite, but those in charge of our industrial complex have gotten a lot of attention. But really today, the focus we're learning needs to be on the consumer, because the choices that we make can direct the nation's energy future. We're increasingly a consumer-driven society. We vote with our feet, our 2 feet in shopping malls, grocery stores, car dealerships, and voting booths as well. So managing today's energy problems, we conjecture, propose, will require a polycentric approach that works at many different scales. The local facts matter, but in order to scale this solutions to this problem, we need a global strategy. So while intervention by governments is important, it's often much more effective when implemented at a variety of different scales and with a plurality of stakeholders, so that we can have the speed, the scope, and the magnitude required to repair the planet. What did I do?
Good. So you yield back.
Oh, am I yielding time back? Well, can I just argue for later?
Well, first I'd like to congratulate Marilyn and Benjamin for writing an excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it and learned a lot. It just really explores the whole multifaceted, multidimensional problem and possible solution space. Now, the question that I've been asked to address is, have the authors characterized the climate challenge correctly? If we rephrase that to say, have the authors accurately characterized the climate challenge as reflected by international and national assessments, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, assessment reports, and the National Academy reports, I would say absolutely yes.
You're here.
They accurately characterize this, and then Marilyn herself has played a leading role in one of the recent national assessment reports. Taking a step back from that, do I currently think that those assessment reports are as good as they should be? Or do they, my concern with those assessment reports is I think they present an overconfident picture of our understanding of how the climate system works and how much we actually know about it, and what actually constitutes dangerous climate change. Again, that's a complex value judgment and a whole host of causal chains of reasoning with massive uncertainties at every step to draw those kind of conclusions. So I think the whole climate change problem and its impacts is really associated with more ignorance and more uncertainty than is generally credited. And people who, to say something like that, what I'm saying, something that, if people just heard the words that I just said out of the context of, who I am, they would say, oh, that's a denier talking. Okay. All right. No, I'm not a denier. The issue is that there is potentially catastrophic impacts associated with the climate change that we might see on the time scale of a century, or it might be pretty minimal. We don't really know. What do we do? And the whole issue of what is dangerous is something that hasn't been adequately confronted. In terms of, if you take the example of Haiti and Dominican Republic, who are exposed to pretty much the same environmental insults, and you get a little tropical storm passing over the island, then massive deaths, landslide, disaster in Haiti, and not much happens in the Dominican Republic. Well, what is it? It's about resilience, okay, of the society and the infrastructure and whatever. So what is dangerous depends very much on resilience or vulnerability or lack thereof. Okay, so it's actually a rather complex issue trying to figure out what is actually dangerous. So what do you do with all this uncertainty and potential ignorance? Do you throw up your hand and do nothing or wait and see? Or do you take a precautionary approach, such as the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention? What do you do? Well, the problems with the precautionary principle for this particular problem as I see it is that we don't really know it, but we have an emissions target that we think is tied to 2 degrees climate change that we think is associated with certain impacts, when there's a whole lot of space to be wrong. Okay, if the emissions reductions that we undertake turn out not to be anywhere close to sufficient to actually meet the problem as it emerges, what are we left with? Or if it turns out that the climate change problem just really wasn't going to be much anyways, we wasted a whole lot of money that could have been otherwise been used to increase the resiliency to severe weather events for various vulnerable countries. So we don't know. This is like in the decision science world, this is called decision making under deep uncertainty. You don't have to do nothing, but you have to think about a broad range of options. And one of the things that I like about the book is they put forward a broad range of options. It's not just precautionary principle versus do nothing. There is the whole idea of economic development that would reduce vulnerability, and of course that needs more energy. But there's adaptive management activities, but there's also the strategy to broaden the parameters that you include in your decision-making space, such as rather than just talk about climate energy nexus, broaden the solution space to include issues of energy security and economics, etc., which is exactly what they've done in the book. So once you, again, there's not enough, to confidence in our understanding of the climate change science and its impacts to really justify, in my opinion, the hard sort of emission stabilization targets. And so I think broadening the solution space to bring in these other issues like energy security, economics, environmental quality, etc., is the right way to go. And so I think this is exactly what they've done in the book to sort of combine these things in the sort of energy security issue and the climate change issue also. So that's why I think the book has the potential to make a big impact, in our discussion about policy options.
Good afternoon, and let me begin as well by congratulating Marilyn and Benjamin on what is a very thought-provoking book with a tremendous amount of information contained within. So as you see on the agenda, I'm asked to address the question of whether the technologies needed for global energy security and climate control, if that's a careful word, are in hand. And that's a daunting question, and if you read that part of the book, you certainly come away with a sense of just how complicated a question and how many different technology components we're talking about. But having said that, I want to begin my comments by saying that as complicated as the technology area is, I'm awfully glad I wasn't asked to address climate, or asked to address geo-engineering, or asked to address the social and behavioral and policy aspects that are all needed to be integrated together to have a coherent energy policy for our country, and for the planet. So in terms of addressing the technology questions, you certainly come away from reading this text with a clear sense that the problems, and there are many pluralities to that problems, many issues, are incredibly numerous, and clearly there's no silver bullet in any one area that is going to help move us forward on any of the major technology areas where we need to advance. So just to categorize, as Marilyn and Benjamin did very well in their text, what are the major areas of technology that we're talking about? If you look at the distribution of energy consumption in our country, it's around 40% of it, raw energy consumption, is associated with the buildings and infrastructure that we house ourselves in, both commercially and residentially. So that accounts for about 40% of it. Another big portion of it, more than 30%, I believe, is in the realm of transportation. So of course, very many complications in transportation. And then a smaller portion, 27% or so, associated with industrial processes. And the authors attempt to jump in and give us some information on technologies associated with each of those areas. And we could spend hours, and I'm sure the authors have, spent many hours thinking about, learning about, pursuing the details of any one of those technology sectors or subsectors of those technologies. So if we talk about energy sources for a second, so in terms of where the energy comes from, I just mentioned where it ends up going to, but if we look at our sources of energy, more than 70% for the country are coming from fossil-based fuels. And then supplemented by, in terms of our electricity production, maybe 20% of it coming from nuclear, which is historically based. Nuclear plants that have been out there for many years and are having their lifetimes extended from 40 to 50 to 60 years because they are, operating reliably moving forward, and because it's difficult to bring new ones online. So we have those sectors. But you read an awful lot about the technologies. Are the technologies here, is the basic question, that will help us make progress toward a more sustainable and cleaner energy future? And the answer is yes. There's wind technology, photovoltaic technology, geothermal technology. All of these things are in fact in hand and are in front of us. But for some reason, our country is not implementing them even as effectively as are some other nations around the world. And so that's why I'm happy that others have the challenge of discussing the geopolitical and the social behavioral aspects of our energy issues. But in some sense, the technologies for accomplishing some of these things are in fact there. Certainly the technologies for advancing and improving our current situation are in front of us. Much of it comes down to cost, much of it comes down to behavior. If we look at renewable energy providing electricity to our nation, yes, wind has been growing rather dramatically. It's the fastest growing sector of renewable energy that we have in the nation. And if I remember the number correctly, we've gotten to the point where we have, do we have 10 gigs online?
More.
Pardon?
More.
So I think in 2010, we crested the 10 gigawatt capacity for bringing wind online. Again, though, a very small fraction of what we need to do, because with wind as the largest and fastest growing component of the renewable energy sector, it still constitutes only 3% of our electricity generation. So in order for us to advance, monumental investments are needed to put more wind in line, more solar panels in place, and then, of course, the associated infrastructure to support it and utilize it effectively. But if you read through this book, you find all of the depth of activities that are needed to support bringing new wind online, additional transmission lines, additional distribution systems, similarly with solar arrays and bringing those into place. And then if you move over into the realm of transportation, you have the same types of issues and technologies, certain uncertainties of technologies. Certainly having hybrid electric vehicles would be very, very helpful to have online. They are becoming more prevalent and accessible, but again, constituting an incredibly small fraction of our fleet. And so what's needed to advance those? Additional battery technology, additional storage technology. If you're going to power up your hybrid electric vehicle or your associated or your electric vehicle, if we move into the realm of full electric transportation, then the power has to come, now you're back into the electricity sector. What's generating that power? Where is it all coming from? And is that power generation, in fact, cleaner than powering that car by using gasoline? So lots and lots of complicated questions, which, and I'll echo Judy's comment here, my goodness, there's just an awful lot to think about in all of these areas. But I think the authors have done a wonderful job of putting those technology issues on the table in front of us. And again, I think the main thing that you come away with in reading through this book is that there is no silver bullet, that it's going to take a great deal of work, and it will take a long period of time for us to evolve away from our incredible dependency on fossil fuel. But again, some of the reports that are out there put together by very learned scientists and engineers who have thought through these problems very carefully. I think when you read those reports at the national level and you read through the book, you come away with the clear understanding that we are not going to get away from fossil fuels anytime soon. But if we don't push and advance alternatives to fossil fuels very effectively now, and develop the policies and investment strategies that go with that, then we will find ourselves potentially in a state of problems with respect to our environment and with our global climate. So with that, I'll stop and pass it on to my colleague Tom.
I would also like to start out by congratulating Marilyn and Benjamin on a very funny book. The question that Marilyn asked me to address is, can we geo-engineer the climate and adapt to its consequences? So I agree with Bob. I wish I didn't get this question. I would ask a simpler question. Who in the audience knows the definition of geo-engineering? Could you help me here? What's your definition of geo-engineering?
Manipulation of climate at the scale of the globe.
Okay, so that's quite good. Yeah, well, I'm impressed. Okay, so Marilyn helped me out here, and I read a fair amount on this, and so it is very similar to what your definition that you gave. It's geoengineering is a very vague term. In fact, it's extremely controversial. In fact, the work that I read and the reports that I read redefine it basically in terms of climate remediation, and Judy used the word climate control. So this is at some level a form of climate control on a large scale, global scale. And since it's such a large scale, when you invoke a strategy to try and implement this, you necessarily have high risk. And high risk could come with high consequences, or in some cases, certainly unintentional consequences. So this particular question is very much about managing risk and trying to make informed decisions based on technologies and strategies that aren't really tested or that have not really been implemented, as opposed to some of the ones that Bob mentioned in the alternative energy sector, which have a lot more history. There is a recent National Academy report on this very topic. It's a very, very important topic. It's received a significant amount of attention. It's called Advancing the Science of Climate Change, so they don't call it geoengineering. They're pretty careful about redefining the term, mostly in terms of climate change. They like to use the word remediation. But the bottom line is, it says, there is a need for major federal government oversight and full-scale involvement in climate remediation. Okay, and then there's a series of recommendations that come out, as with any National Academy report. Now, with regard to remediation, there's two formal areas they sort of focus on, and like Bob intimated, is we will still have fossil fuels as a significant component of the future energy sector. And so with that always comes concern with regard to CO2 emissions and the greenhouse gases. And so the first main type of geoengineering, they refer to it as CDR, which is simply carbon dioxide reduction, and strategies for basically remediating CO2. Now this is something that has not escaped the Department of Energy. It's one of their primary focus areas, both in applied and fundamental researches in CO2 sequestration. The other area is called solar radiation management, SRM. So you'll see CDR and SRM acronyms as you read through a lot of this. And this is designed to reduce the Earth's absorption of energy from sunlight. So it's basically playing games with the reflective properties of our upper atmosphere, purposefully changing the reflective properties of the stratosphere and the clouds. Right now, it turns out CDR has been something that the government has been supporting for a number of years, but under sort of different umbrellas, and it's there's reforestation strategies that are going on, no-till agriculture. These sorts of things have been sort of in process for quite a while. These are sort of not considered energy related because they're more from a normal anthropogenic source or normal sources of CO2. When you tie CDR to burning of fossil fuels, then it necessarily becomes also part of the global energy issue. There are some CDR technologies that are on the board to be implemented, and they're storing carbon by planting more trees, inducing growth of more plankton in the ocean by fertilizing it with iron and different nutrients, create machines or technologies to collect CO2 and other greenhouse gases from the air, and to enhance terrestrial and ocean rock weathering, because these rocks also can basically do CO2 sequestration. So, and then there's another one which is based on genetic modification of plants and microorganisms. And so there's a significant body of or ideas of how to go about these, but most of them have not been tested or tried. The National Academy report really focused on SRMs, which is increasing the amount of solar radiation reflected by introducing aerosols into the stratosphere as the one strategy. And the second strategy is cloud seeding. Cloud seeding by spraying droplets of seawater into the atmosphere, making many more smaller particles and changing the overall heat capacities and making more clouds, basically. So, one of the questions is this a good thing to do? Can we do this? And can this be done at a scale that really matters? Can it be done in a way that can have an impact globally? And then could this be done at a reasonable cost if the risk assessments are such that it should go forward? Or, can we really do this without knowing what unintentional consequences may come about? The bottom line is that there has been an experiment for this SRM approach, and it's when the volcano Pinatubo erupted in 1971. I think that the climate people know this. There was a measurable drop in the global climate or the global temperature, but there were a lot of other consequences that happened from this volcanic eruption. Right? And so I think that it behooves us to make sure that we have the appropriate political assessment of this in terms of cost and a risk benefit. And it's a very complicated question that Marilyn forced me to think about. I actually thank you for that.
So, of course, I want to join the others in congratulating Marilyn and Ben on a really very interesting and important book. But from my memory of high school debate, to have a debate, you have to have two sides. And I assumed that I was assigned the negative here. So, is polycentrism the policy answer? I would say that even based on the evidence presented by Brown and Sovacool, it's not. It's clear that the answer to the question is no. I'm going to defend an alternative claim that if we're going to get out of this dangerous situation we're now in with respect to climate change, it will be accomplished by actions at the local, state, and regional levels rather than through top-down global quantifications. In other words, we're currently pursuing a polycentric strategy, and guess what? It's not working. The evidence is, for example, that even during a recession, we're still increasing the amount of CO2 that we're producing. So let's begin by examining the arguments for polycentrism in climate change and global energy security. First, let's note that there's a serious flaw in the Brown-Sovacool argument for the importance of strong effects at the global level. Their arguments hide a crucial ambiguity in their reasoning. Distinguish, if you will, two hypotheses about global efforts. Hypothesis 1. Global efforts to limit GHG, if agreed upon and implemented, would result in great gains in emissions reductions and forestall climate change. We can call this the coulda, woulda, shoulda hypothesis. Hypothesis 2 would say that global efforts to limit greenhouse gases have in fact helped to reduce emissions. I guess we can call that the reality show hypothesis. So next, note that virtually all of the arguments in the first half of Chapter 7 supporting global options is directed at establishing the coulda, woulda, shoulda hypothesis, and virtually no evidence is provided for the reality show hypothesis. If we examine that hypothesis, the latter one, if we were to ask, that is, how have the meetings in Kyoto, Durban, Nairobi, Cancun, Geneva, Copenhagen, Bali, on and on, contributed to curbing climate change? I think what we've learned is that for all the progress made at those meetings, we might be further down the road to mitigating climate change if the diplomats had all stayed home, saved jet fuel, and avoided the signing or not signing of worthless agreements. In other words, Brown and Sovacool have argued hypothetically that if the countries of the world would unite behind a strong agreement, that is, by instituting mandatory GHG mitigation policies, then this step would lead to less climate change. Unfortunately, this is a counterfactual hypothetical. How much more evidence do we need to conclude that in any plausible reality show, the global efforts are negligible for the foreseeable future? Turn now to the positive evidence they provide for the importance of local efforts. Here they can cite present and actual cases where local, state, and regional governments are acting creatively and effectively to reduce GHG emissions. When discussing local and regional efforts, they address the reality show version of the hypothesis, and they provide real evidence that localism is working, and that it would work if, not that it would work if some impossible agreement were magically passed in the coulda, shoulda, woulda world they examine when supporting the value of global efforts. Their comparison of advantages of global and local approaches compares unfulfilled promises of global efforts with actual real-world successful efforts at the local level. As Brown and Sovacool admit on page 234, all carbon and other anthropogenic GHG emissions are created somewhere, in some place. Further, it's clear that every local community in the world will eventually feel negative impacts from climate change. So it's no mystery why local people want to take action before their lifestyles are damaged or destroyed by one of the main many negative impacts of climate change. But since pollution sources are local, it makes sense to deal with them locally. More importantly, as Brown and Sovacool correctly argue, one-size-fits-all solutions more often than not turn out to be one-size-fits-nobody. And so they clearly recognize not only that, but why local approaches are more successful than global ones. Furthermore, they plausibly claim that setting minimal global standards can also prevent communities from adopting optimal standards of their own. Page 236. Continuing with the discussion of the successes of local and regional efforts, Brown and Sovacool note the remarkable flexibility of local responses, ranging from conservation measures like combining power and heating systems, better monitoring equipment for end users, fuels from agricultural waste, burning methane from landfills, wind power, geothermal power, tidal currents, and so on. Most of these methods can be very useful in some places and are worthless in others, suggesting that current global efforts are actually will actually damage the goals of avoiding climate change. We don't need top-down dictators. We need local ingenuity and creativity able to respond to locally available opportunities. If we judge policies on the basis of what is actually happening in the real reality show, that is, the world, as we experience it, polycentrism is not working. Promised advantages of global efforts have not been realized. As Brown and Sovacool acknowledged, the only empirically observable successes in addressing GHG emissions are occurring at local and regional levels. Emphasis on the global scale and the ineffective global organizations that pontificate but fail to pass meaningful mandatory guidelines actually undercut local efforts and motivation by encouraging local actors to wait for promised but not forthcoming global breakthroughs. So in conclusion, the Brown and Sovacool argument for polycentrism in Chapter 7 fails because it compares coulda, woulda, shoulda advantages of global approaches with effective actions in the form of real projects that are occurring locally and regionally. For my part, I'm not betting on globe-trotting diplomats, most of whom are under the thumb of powerful interest groups that currently benefit from a status quo reliance on fossil fuels. I'm counting on 8 billion creative minds, especially the basement inventors and the garage tinkerers, who will join with their neighbors and fellow citizens to create locally appropriate and successful solutions to GHG emissions in their own neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, let me first thank Professor Norton for not kicking me off the table. Well, I guess I've got my work cut out for me, huh? I guess I'll start by thanking, of course, the panelists for providing both praise and warranted criticism about our book. I figured I'd just go in order. I had the most difficult part of trying to be the rebuttalist, so excuse me if my logic chain isn't entirely complete. I think Judy's point about the legitimacy of national assessments and global assessments of the climate problem is a good one. There is still uncertainty in a lot of those documents, and even the fifth assessment. The most recent one was 2007, called the AR4, the fourth assessment. The fifth assessment is coming out next year, a couple of years. Even that will still have uncertainties. And if you read the documents, they talk about the language of probabilities. Things are likely or unlikely, very likely. They don't say it will or will not happen. That said, I think it's really important to underscore that even with those flaws, even with the imperfections in the IPCC methodology and other methodologies, we already know enough. We already know enough to conclusively say, without a doubt, that the climate is warming or cooling, climate change is occurring. We also know within those bounded brackets of air that it's not going to be good for us or the planet. There's an excellent piece of work by sociologist Paul Edwards that was just published, also with MIT Press, there's my plug for the press, came out in 2011 about climate science, and it does an excellent job picturing and showing you the history of both climate science and atmospheric science and all the uncertainties in weather records and samples and everything. And at the end of the book, he does a brilliant job showing you all of the actual uncertainties. And he says, this may make the climate skeptics very happy, But I have a very different conclusion. He says, I've been in the archives. I've looked at the history of climate science for a century. And I think it's as good as it needs to be to tell us without a doubt that we already know everything we need to know. Granted, the models will get better, they'll get more refined. We'll probably get a better picture about the emerging scenarios that will happen down the road. But we already know enough that we should all be very concerned with climate change. And I don't think we have to keep tinkering with air brackets and standard deviations to know that, well, if we don't start to address it very soon, we're in for some very serious trouble. I once saw a climate debate that was excellent, and Bill McKibben said that the opponents of climate change, and I'm not saying that Judy is an opponent, they often like to paint the climate picture as if it was a house of cards. If you remove one card, you've won the debate because the whole house of climate science falls in on itself. And Bill said, no, it's actually more accurate to say it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And even if we have some of the pieces of the puzzle wrong, the puzzle is already complete enough that we know what we need to know to be concerned, which is why you have, I think, a legitimate consensus of scientists and social scientists about the gravity and severity of the climate change problem. So don't let Judy's very good arguments about uncertainty and how risk is constructed, distract us from that central fact. Bob's point about technology and us not having a silver bullet, and his points about renewables are very spot on. And we actually started, I think it was that chapter, maybe it was another chapter, referencing Kurt Vonnegut in Slaughterhouse 5, which is a book about the bombing of Dresden that I had to read in high school. And he talks somewhere in the middle of the book about what a magical thing it would be if you could take all these machines of war and watch them go backwards. So you'd see these bombers that were landing with broken wings and engines on fire in American air bases, take off in reverse, go over Germany, suck up all the bombs, bring people back to life, and then they would be, of course, at the other end, intact, ready to take off. And Marilyn and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we could devise a climate system of technologies that would do the same thing? We could see our power plants not emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but actually sucking them into the smokestacks, depositing them into nice bricks of coal, moving them to where they need to be stored deep in the earth, and then we never have to worry about them again. And we said no yet system of magical climate technology exists yet. But I think we were somewhat wrong in that it actually does. And I think it does in terms of energy efficiency and renewables, because those technologies, every kilowatt hour or every, megawatt that you use is a ton of coal, a cubic foot of natural gas, a separator working unit of uranium that you keep in the ground where it doesn't have to emit greenhouse gases. And these are all relatively simple things that we could each do, whether it's changing your light bulb, buying a more efficient car, voting for a candidate who supports renewable energy, buying shares in a clean energy company. You can do all of these things that are relatively simple and relatively quick. Eat less meat is one thing that you could do. Take colder showers is another thing that you could do. Wash your clothes in cold water is another thing you could do. Don't use a dryer in the summer. You could just hang your clothes to dry. All of these things can add up to pretty significant reductions in your own carbon footprint. So while I think there's no silver bullet technology, let's not also forget that it's not just about technology. It's also about individual choices that we all make, even as we parade around Georgia Tech and eat out of styrofoam cups and plastic bags and things like that, which we all do, and we're all complicit in. Tom's point about geoengineering, we kind of gave him a really hard question. I'm sorry about that. And it was kind of a mischievous question because in that chapter of the book, we don't really advocate geoengineering. We discuss it. We discuss some of the options, but those two chapters, the second and third chapters of the book, for those of you that haven't bought it yet, are really divided into mitigation technologies and adaptation / geoengineering technologies. And even then, we have kind of a matrix of technologies that are now available and technologies that are kind of really near the end of the pipeline. They're available in the next 5 to 10 years. Geoengineering, all of those technologies are in, if ever, the 5 to 10 year pipeline. And I think what's important to recognize is many of the mitigation technologies, whether it's energy efficiency, solar, wind, industrial energy efficiency, carpooling, electric vehicles, are already here. And many of the adaptation technologies that build resilience and adaptive capacity are also already here. Agricultural diversification, better water collection and catchment systems, better weather forecasting, better insurance premiums, or better insurance assessment, we already have. So while it was right to kind of question the geoengineering picture, the chapter also talks about, 40 or 45 adaptation technologies that not just the US can use, but also countries around the world that will be most at risk to climate change. And those technologies don't deal with large-scale climatic, remediation or control. They deal with very smaller-scale things like planting trees, or doing beach nourishment, or changing your crop production patterns, or changing your drip irrigation instead of pumped water, or the alternative type of irrigation, or using organic fertilizer instead of chemical fertilizer. So all of those types of things can build resilience and don't have to tinker with the climate. Another good analogy that I've heard and I like is, unfortunately, geo-engineering is like if you have a helmet on and you have a gun pointed at your head, and you think the solution is to keep firing the gun but make a better helmet. Whereas maybe a better option is mitigation, which will be let's remove the gun and the bullets in the first place. Okay, now we get to Professor Norton, who has, thankfully I guess, engaged us in a true debate, questioning polycentrism. And I have to say he's very shrewd because he's put us, at least in his rhetoric, as having to defend global bureaucrats, which I think nobody wants to do. But I think we should be fair about what we mean by polycentrism. By polycentrism, we didn't mean global versus local. We were very careful in how we described polycentrism. Polycentric systems are those systems that have two sets of interlapping actors and scales. In terms of actors, we're talking about systems of governance that involve usually the government, as well as civil society, the private sector, advocacy groups, and consumers. So a polycentric system is all of those. Whereas, thank you, I can't see that side of the table. Whereas a non-polycentric system would be the kind of top-down Kyoto Protocol approach. It also involves a variety of different scales, not just local versus global, but also the kind of scales in between, state, regional, national, etc. And all of our successful case studies, which you neglected to mention, have all shown in a variety of sectors and areas from water to forestry to energy and transport, electricity supply, where we've listed 8 cases of where polycentrism has worked in the real world. Whether it's Singapore managing almost 2 million vehicles with demand-side management of licenses, or it's Denmark doing pretty ingenious subsidies aimed at wind and combined heat and power coupled with feed-in tariffs and carbon taxes, or it's China, where they've implemented 200 million improved cook stoves in less than a decade. In each of those cases, you saw our polycentrism hypothesis confirmed by the real world because they've included national, regional, and local actors, as well as civil society, private sector groups, and government. So in that way, the way that we frame polycentrism, our case studies at least I think conclusively show that we met it. So to conclude, the Supreme Court Justice, who's been long dead, Oliver Wendell Holmes, once said, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. And with that in mind, the empirical record and historical success of our 8 polycentric case studies, I think, for at least Marilyn and I, show that Professor Norton is well-intentioned, but misguided when he looks at the real world and experiences. Thank you.
There were some actors, some global actors involved in some of those case studies. By polycentric, at the top-down level, we mean national or global. The Oasis Project case, which is a forestation in the Atlantic rainforest in Brazil to help preserve water that feeds Sao Paulo. You had global actors in the form of the Mitsubishi Corporation, people from RED, the RED, reducing emissions for deforestation degradation, and an international cosmetics company that were funneling resources to help this conservation scheme. And in the Chinese cook stoves case, you have the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, UNDP, UNESCAP, and UNIDO involved in designing that program. But you'd only know that if you read the footnotes of the book, not the actual text of the book, but I don't blame you, there are more than 1,000 footnotes of the book. And he's generally right. As you get to the global scale, the coordination and what are called collective action problems become so difficult that most of our polycentrism, as centralized or as top-heavy as we get, is the national level.
But that doesn't mean that we should give up on the global approach, because we really need it to be able to scale up to meet the needs of the problem. So we've got to continue to see what went wrong in order to know how to do it better.
Here, here. So I guess we're going to vote on this resolution now. which for the students in the School of Public Policy, deciding between Dr. Brown and Dr. Norton is like choosing one of your parents. You may see some abstentions, but I guess all who think the authors got it right.
Make them close their eyes.
I guess round of applause. Round of applause. Those who are on, mostly Dr. Norton who went against it, those who are on this side.
Why can't they both have it?
That too. Well, you get caught for both.
I'll give you an example. When we did studies of deforestation in Brazil, where a Rondônia was essentially the size of East Germany was deforested within 15, 20 years. And we were calculating CO2 emissions, but also other damages to the land. So you have a top-down policy which says, we're going to move these folks from other parts of Brazil and we'll give them the land. And we passed a law that said, okay, you can get so many acres, you can only use half. So everybody cleared half, they sold it to the next guy, and he cleared half. You know that thing about getting to the wall, if you go halfway, you never get there. Well, they're about this back in the wall. See, so that was a top-down decision that was made. And at the same time, there were people coming in and planting new crops and doing stuff from the bottom up, trying things, trying different things, buying up land, getting people who had towers of capital saved on land, buying it up, doing lots of individual attempts to do something. So that to me says the top-down wasn't paying any attention to the bottom. So top-down is good, but where do you get the idea from to make the top-down policy? And you can learn that, I would argue, from the bottom up.
So are we opening to questions?
Is there time for one question that I could address to the authors? So if I may, slightly changing the discussion a little bit, the focus of the discussion. If you were supreme ruler, what is the one action that you might take to move us forward in this complicated problem space?
I would implement a program of policy reform that sweeps the carpet clean of all of those obstacles of rules and regulations that we put in place, probably for a well-intentioned purpose originally, but that have since become an obstacle to progress in climate, and a lot of that, and energy security as well. And we do continue to put in place new policies such as ethanol, renewable fuel standards. It's promoting mostly corn-based ethanol. And we know that that's not the direction we need to go. We just need to stop that. So I'd maybe put in place some form of oversight and reform of policy, the policy space. That would be what I'd be interested in doing.
If I could answer as well, or maybe supreme rule as a moment. A similar answer, and I mean, there is no single thing you could do. We've done a few studies that have talked about 4 or 5 things you should do in concert together. But to stick to the question, the number one answer we got from the types of studies we did, both with qualitative research interviews of experts and quantitative modeling, was remove subsidies for fossil fuels and nuclear power. You can even remove subsidies for renewables and across the board, desubsidize energy, and renewables would still compete pretty well. It's just that fossil fuels and nuclear power have gotten 3/4 of all federal subsidies going back to the 50s, and in the past decade, it's still heavily biased towards those two sources.
Similarly, the National Academy study that you referred to, Tom would say put a price on carbon, which is comparable to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Yeah.
So no carbon tax?
Yeah, price on carbon, that's it. Yes, carbon tax, yeah.
So, and then with respect to nuclear subsidies, the only reason we need to subsidize nuclear power in this country is because it takes us 12 to 15 years to build a nuclear power plant and finance it along the way. I noted in your book that in South Korea, they're being built in less than 5 years. And so if we were able to actually do something like that and be efficient about it, there would be no need to subsidize nuclear at all.
Limited liability for
for accidents, free storage of fuel.
Access
flow,
to sufficient financing, you need, you need
Yeah.
$7 or $8 billion today to build a nuclear plant, and not every utility has that, so definitely help with the financing is needed.
But that's
Because, you know,
associated with how long it takes to build. If we take your recommendation of clearing the policy space, it wouldn't take 12 to 15 years, and it wouldn't cost $7 million.
true. That's very true.
It's a cascade,
Yeah.
so many interconnected things, but I was expecting to hear carbon tax.
Yeah, I should have been my
It was included in your speaking before.
Yeah, it is the policy approach.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
much.
So are we going to take a few questions? Yes.
Yeah, so the question was actually just on this issue of the human protocol and the intangible impacts of these types of global, international negotiations. And so in particular, one of the impacts that Benjamin mentioned are the direct result of one form or another of the Kyoto Protocol. So if you look at the CN and the impact that has had on energy finance in China, you look at the development of RAG within Southeast Asia, you look at a lot of the initiatives in Singapore, they're directly related to the Kyoto Protocol leading to the European Union emissions trading system and creating a price signal on carbon that translates not only from Europe but to other regions. And so I'm wondering what specifically is the impact or the relationship of those intangible aspects of agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and how they communicate through the private sector.
I had to say that the Kyoto Protocol has been highly variable in its impact. It's been essentially ineffective in Canada, for instance. We've seen their emissions rise. But I think we always need to keep in mind the ultimate goal, and that is to have a global system where emissions can be reduced where it's cheapest to reduce, and where it's difficult or impossible that they are allowed to purchase those emissions. And you can only do that with some form of a market-based system that requires international accords and agreements. So while I know that our global globetrotters have consumed a lot of carbon and maybe directly and not directly achieved their goals, I do think we need to continue to support their efforts. And there are those indirect, you made some very good examples of indirect benefits that have occurred in certain places, not across the board.
Aren't some of the critiques sort of based on the assumption that it's easier to mow the grass on the other side of the fence? You have on the one hand, the data starts getting collected in the 1950s. It's been out there critiqued for a long time. You have international peer review. You have policy reviews that have been critiqued. Probably aren't perfect, but seem to be pretty well supported. And then you can sort of come along and say, well, we'll have resilience without having a specific plan for what you do with Bangladesh, which has this massive population. And as a political scientist or economist who look at Bangladesh, you think climate change is hard. That's probably harder. The idea that we're going to put sulfates up there, probably worth looking at, but they don't stay up anywhere near as long as carbon, which is up there for decades. And the idea that we would abandon the attempts to get a global solution without addressing the issue of leakage that Nordhaus has been discussing for the last 20, 30 years seems to me hard to defend. It seems to me if there's going to be a critique, if there's some better way to do this, we need a little more meat on the bone about what that is.
Well, you maybe provided an opening for me to talk about some of the solar radiation management options, not necessarily the sulfates in the stratosphere, but reflective surfaces, white roofs. What could be wrong with that? I mean, that is something we could roll out globally, and that would help to improve the albedo of the Earth, and that would reflect solar radiation. So there are, I know some of the...
I would agree with you. I mean, I think those are all technologies that are out there. So you have the reduced carbon emissions strategy, which has been thought through. It's very difficult politically. I'm just questioning the assumption that some of the alternatives that are thrown out there are somehow going to be easier. than that, as difficult as that is.
Yeah, and that actually, the white roof solution is the focus of a major global collaboration that the U.S. has led. So while we think of ourselves as being so far behind in many respects, not being a signatory to the Kyoto Accord, we are making a lot of progress in our major economies meetings, trying to move people along toward higher, better performing technologies. But yeah, some of them are pretty, risk management is the issue, and policy issues abound, because we know that a rogue nation could, with one of these geo-engineering tools, destroy the planet, and yet we don't have anything in place to monitor throwing of plankton into the ocean in order to fertilize, flowing iron into the ocean to fertilize the plankton creation. Yeah, no controls, no monitoring. Scary.
A good compliment is just with the Professor Norton and us leading into kind of some of the challenges to polycentrism, but one of the hypothetical benefits, and at least in Eleanor Ostром's work, she's proven it in a few cases where you have rivership management or management of other shared resources, is when you have a system that has multiple actors at the variety of scales, global, national, local, et cetera, all working in concert. If one of those approaches fails, i.e. the global one, you still have the others that have created the safety net. And so there are great examples of if you have local and, let's say, national leaders that are already committed to reducing emissions, plus global leaders trying to do the same thing. If we don't get to the Kyoto Protocol, but the U.S. does something at the national level, it's almost as good. And so let's not forget that if the global doesn't have much likelihood of succeeding, we should still try. And if we've matched it properly with actors or actions at other scales, then we've still created a system that is far better than the one we've currently got, which is almost complete with paralysis or inaction.
This is related to the question of scale. So if you looked at the pollution control system in the United States and you looked at the last 100 years, for most of that time, the federal approach was in fact quite ineffective and mostly not there. The efforts to in fact manage the problem were local. It was very uneven and very ineffective. And part of the reason is, of course, it was a common pool. And actually, you can make even stronger arguments about why local control over air pollution would have made more sense at that time, because most of the costs associated with that were experienced by the people living in those particular communities. There's very little transfer to other communities across the air basin. So this strikes me as the issue of greenhouse gases that are clearly a global problem. What you do at a local level is going to have virtually no impact on the larger system. And we are in the same position vis-a-vis no international institutions that can actually manage this very effectively. And here we are trying to create those institutions in order to respond to it. It seems to me that that this idea of just focusing in on the institutions we already have that have some success is very short-sighted, and I'm wondering if you could respond to that, about why you would think that this problem can be resolved by simply looking at the level of national and subnational institutions without, in fact, trying to strengthen the international ones.
I think
this is actually a question to Bryan.
Okay, go ahead, Bryan. But if you I'll add to you.
I would like your response too, but I said Bryan is the one who made the comment. So.
Well, of course, if we had effective global institutions, that would be great. And I'm certainly not suggesting that it wouldn't be a good development. I just don't think it's going to happen in the foreseeable future. And we better be working on the problem from the other end. Now, I mean, I'm just taking devil's advocate, but on the other hand, I mean, I do believe that I don't see the next global meeting coming up with mandatory limits or anything that's really effective. So, I mean, I'm just making, I'm not making a comment about whether it would be desirable for there to be a global agreement. I'm just saying, I don't see it happen. So my point would be that polycentrism isn't working because, to the extent at least that polycentrism requires that we have some kind of global guidance, and we don't have it.
So the question maybe a little, I mean, yes, we don't have it now, but is it worth spending energy and time in order to create it, even though we know it will not happen in the next decade?
Yes, I would say yes, but I'd also say that the problem isn't just getting an agreement. The problem is we don't have what you might call a world community where people are accepting responsibility at the global level. So I mean, to me, it isn't just a matter of one of these times we'll get all those people together in one of those cities somewhere in the world, and they'll all happen to vote for and agree to a global agreement. We don't have the kind of community and the kind of commitment of governments that would be necessary for them to give up the kind of their quote unquote sovereignty enough to join an agreement. So to me, it's not just happenstance that we haven't succeeded. We're very far from it because we don't have as I would say, the sort of the community, the sense of responsibility that's necessary.
However, we were able to pass the Montreal Protocol and ban ozone depleting chemicals, which is a great example of the world coming together. So it has been done, and there are previous examples too.
So narrow and simple a problem compared to climate change. I mean, all you had to do is to reform one industry, basically, to deal with that problem. And as soon as as soon as the industry realized that they could actually take advantage of this form of these rules, they were all for it. But it doesn't carry over to climate change because there's not some particular industry you can bribe with the opportunity to get rid of.
I've got an example of an activity that humanity did that was instrumental in the economy and was probably worth 50 to 60% of global GDP at the time it was abolished: slavery. So we've come through before around a moral issue that would have cost us a lot of money, but we did act because we thought it was right. And now I know there are still small pockets of slavery around the world, but it's by and large our global norm that it's immoral to have slaves, as it should be.
And that took, how many thousand years?
We did it, and we did it relatively in the past few hundred years. Janelle, do you have...
Yeah, well, what about the soft power impacts? Because, again, this gets back to this issue of scaling from local to global in some sense. The reason that China cares about energy intensity, maybe we can't really say emissions reductions, but energy intensity, to the degree that it does is in part because of the Kyoto Protocol. That created the awareness. And in the last 5 years since the introduction of the CDM, it has become the leading producer of solar and wind technology in the world. In a matter of 5 years, it went from 0 to 40% market share. That's remarkable in some sense. There was no binding agreement, but it's related to the Kyoto Protocol.
I'd like to comment on that. I actually think that the statement you made in Maryland makes a big difference. If there's an industry that can see a profit at the end of the pipeline, they will make it happen. And I would argue that could also happen for CO2, except for it's pretty far away from a science and technology perspective. If you could capture CO2 and up-convert it to a storable fuel, the industry makes a profit, you will see CO2 sequestration being pursued by many countries. And a large part of it, I would argue, is driven by what the profit margin is, unfortunately. And that, that as a statement of how reliant we are upon the economics of the situation.
Anyone allow one last question, then we go to science and books?
Okay, sounds good. And you're rating it by having Dr. Southwick ask you.
I like to give examples of a very specific fix and then this global fix. What about the Clean Air Acts? That's pretty broad. It's had an incredible effect on certainly my area, the transportation sector. And it was, from the 70s onwards. So emissions from diesel trucks are not within 1 but 2 orders of magnitude in the last 30 years. Now, that's a top-down decision that I think shows that we can get something done. And I think it's the best one I can think of, with the exception of bringing in real ale into Britain, which took 6 or 8 years to completely change the whole brew industry, which was written up as an example of a whole population responding to it. But the real one, a serious one, is the Clean Air Acts. And we have hydrocarbons, VOCs. These are not local damages. It's not like carbon monoxide on the corridor. These things spread around the country. Chicago affects Atlanta. So I think, there's a real possibility that we've already done something. So my question is, how do you get that to go to CO and deal with CO2?
Well, my answer to that would be, I'm not certainly against top-down solutions, but notice that you shifted to a scale where there is a sovereign nation state that handles, that is the location, so to speak, of this top-down force, and it has its own legitimacy. The federal government, U.S. federal government, has its own legitimacy. The problem with trying to scale that up to the global level is there's no similar government, no sense of legitimacy for action, and essentially no quote-unquote sovereignty. And until that makes a big difference. Now, from that point in the argument, we go to one of 2 directions. One is, one direction is to say, well, for at least a long time in the future, we're not going to get much from Kyoto Protocol type maneuvers. The other way you could go is to say, well, maybe we need to form an international government. I think if I were to say that out loud in Atlanta, I'd probably get shot. So those are your two chances, your 2 choices. But if you really want to take a second choice and say, okay, let's make the United Nations a sovereign power that can enforce rules, etc. And if you can get that through, I would oppose it, but I'm not going to say it out loud.
In the case of the current U.S. policy, it's one of dealing with the major emitting nations. I think that's not a bad way to go, because we can make a lot of progress if the leadership of the major emitters change their approach. And I do want to put a little bit of a plug for the role of the Tennessee Valley Forest, which I am a board member. And at our meeting 2 sessions ago, we voted to retire 18 coal plants, 2.7 gigawatts of electricity from coal. One of the motivations of that was that it helped us to meet what we anticipated to be future environmental regulations and EPA oversights and cleanup. So, I mean, there was again, sort of not direct, but an indirect impact of having that shadow hovering.
You told me it was because they read our book.
Really, yeah. So thank you all for coming out, and there's